all are an anthropologist, I'm an anthropologist, a theologian and a historian in Chicago, our city, and a city that an Egyptian seminarian based in Cairo when I was living there once told me is Protestant Rome. So here you are, our audience, but also our interlocutors on the timely and vital topics of race, religion, and empire. And yes, this book, Race for Revival, sets the tone for our discussion today. But far from conducting an insider conversation on this book, which we certainly recognize that some of you, if not all of you, have not yet read, although I realize that's not true because I understand that really good portion of you have read the text now that I look at your faces. We want to provide an open public forum for reflecting on the problem of race in American religion and society at large. So may ours today be merely one of many more conversations that feature Asians and the Asian Pacific into our campus's spaces of critical inquiry on the study of religion and race in America. Before I move to our event format and speaker bios, I want to first thank our co-sponsors who have made this gathering possible in the first place. The Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture here at the University of Chicago. Thanks especially go to Tiffany Annette, Lauren Pons, Emily Cruz, and Tiara Kilpatrick here at CSRPC, Tiara, who have helped us navigate all the planning and publicity logistics. I also want to give a shout out to Daniel Rim, who is basically executing all the logistical details in real time. And I really would not be able to handle this if it weren't for him. To open our roundtable discussion, Professor Kim will give us an introduction to her book, and then we'll move to comments from Professor Joh, then from me, and finally Helen will offer her response. And our last hour will be reserved for dialogue with you, the audience, in the form of a Q&A, and I'll moderate that for us. So allow me to briefly introduce our discussants and our main speaker. So actually it's only one discussant. Wonhee Anne Joh is Professor of Theology and Culture at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Her work focuses on post-colonialism, decolonialism, critical ethnic, race, and Asian American studies, feminist, queer, and affect theories, and constructive theology. She is the author of Heart of the Cross, a post-colonial Christology, and her most recent co-edited books are titled Critical Theology Against U.S. Militarism in Asia, Decolonization and De-imperialization, and Feminist Praxis Against U.S. Militarism. Helen Jin Kim, who is our featured author for today, is Assistant Professor of American Religious History at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She examines U.S. history and religion in global context, focusing on American religious connections to the Asia Pacific and transnational histories of Asian American religions. Today we're going to be engaging her first single-authored monograph, Race for Revival, How Cold War South Korea Shaped the American Evangelical Empire. She's also the co-author of Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans.
So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon to talk about Race for Revival. Thank you, Dr. Heo, for that introduction, and it was really great to speak with your class this morning, transnational religious movements. And thank you to Dr. Anne Joh for being here and for being a discussant. I'm really eager to hear your comments. And yeah, thanks to the Divinity School, the Martin Marty Center, and also the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Good, did I get that right? Yes. Yeah, and I know Curtis sends his regrets, and we hope he feels better very soon. Today, I do want to just show you a couple slides as I speak. I want to just give you an overview of the argument so you have a sense of what the book is about, and then I'm going to hone in on especially reflections on race and religion from the book. Yeah. Okay, in Race for Revival, I argue that the rise of modern evangelical America depended on America's religious Cold War in Asia. With the outbreak of the Korean War, the first hot war of the Cold War, Koreans became indispensable to the making of modern evangelical America, as seen through these three organizations that I studied. Campus Crusade for Christ, World Vision, and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I exhumed the Korean foundations for all three, and I study a 30-year period, 1950 to 1980, and my work brings together conversations in four major fields, mostly historical, namely American religious history, Korean history, Asian American history, and world Christianity. So I'm working at the intersections of these four conversations, and I use archival sources from both the US and Korea, and oral histories that I've conducted in both countries in English and then in the Korean language. And so, yes, many male voices from archives, because these gendered silences, and nicely the oral histories also get at some of the female voices, but also happy to talk more about that. I was asked, as I mentioned, especially to address how the book wrestles with questions about race and religion. Right. And so my thinking about race and religion in this book is crucially tied to my use of a transpacific frame. What do I mean by transpacific frame? I think this is probably the most important piece for kind of the approach that I take methodologically in this book, because this is the reason for bringing four fields and historical fields in conversation with each other. I'm thinking of the frame that emerges out of Asian American studies, including historian Gary Okihiro's idea that, quote, America is as much a Pacific civilization as it is an Atlantic civilization. Consider Alon Kuroshige, Madeline Su, and Eugene Yaguchi's understanding that Trans-Pacific history tends to bridge two or more conventional fields, including histories of the American West, U.S. immigration and ethnicity, U.S. diplomatic and international relations, Asian American studies, East Asian studies, and Pacific Islander studies. So it's a very interdisciplinary conversation. And as Viet Nguyen and Janet Hoskins note, there are two competing visions, largely when we've studied the Pacific. Right? The Pacific as an arena of economic development and imperial fantasy, or the Pacific as a site of critical engagement with, an evaluation of such development and fantasy. And I think in a lot of ways, my field of American religious history has explored American contact with Asia Pacific or Asian nations, Asian people. But I think in terms of engaging a trans-Pacific frame, as Viet Nguyen and Janet Hoskins are considering, this is largely kind of an emerging development. As much as possible, I wanted to show the latter, right? This critical engagement with an evaluation of such development and fantasy in the Pacific. To not take for granted this idea that Asia Pacific is this arena of economic development and imperial fantasy. And as I was making this intervention with my work, I was thinking especially how could this possibly intersect with the history of American evangelicalism? It almost seemed as if a contradiction in terms. As someone trained in the long history of evangelicalism, primarily in a transatlantic frame, if you're familiar with the field, I mean, that's the Atlantic frame is the primary frame through which America's religious past is actually told. Right? To be sure, so this idea that you would take a Pacific frame or a trans-Pacific frame to America's religious past is very much kind of new conversation. To be sure, in the modern period, especially the 20th and 21st centuries, when we look at that historiography, I mean, historians have featured Asian countries. I mean, there's usually a chapter on China if you're thinking about American Protestant missions in Asia Pacific, for instance. There may be an intro chapter on Korea. There may be some information on Vietnam, and certainly on Japan as well. However, kind of the frame that historians are using to study these points of contact, I think, require real critical inquiry. So for the most part, I think historians of this modern period of America's religious past have featured Asian countries, or occasionally talked about Asian American figures, or have thought about a Pacific turn. right? But for the most part, most have not cited the use of a transpacific frame, as I've just mentioned above, right? This kind of frame that emerges out of the critique of Asian American studies, which centers the history of war, colonialism, and Orientalism in the analysis. So I think if we look back at the historiography, we'll see that kind of making these connections to a transpacific frame is a conversation that is still very much new. So then race, when we think about race in the Trans-Pacific, that's a difficult topic, right? Because we're so used to thinking about America's religious past and race through an Atlantic frame, right? So then suddenly we think about the Pacific, it raises all these questions and thinking about what's the actual approach we're going to use, what are the methods, who are the key thinkers, what are the methods we're going to use becomes a challenge. So in this book, as much as possible, I've tried to foreground race as it pertains to U.S. evangelical history, and I think about Asian and Asian American subjectivity, especially through the lens of Orientalism. And I think other doing, if we don't foreground race in terms of our histories of American religious contact with Asia Pacific, I think we run the risk of replicating narratives of the Pacific as kind of an arena of economic development or imperial fantasy. I think that is kind of a trope that can be replicated. Right? And therefore, it tends to paint a Trans-Pacific religious history as a relatively innocuous past, right? Or move it free of racializing hierarchies. I think there's a tendency to gravitate to think about, oh, the Trans-Pacific lens gets us off the hook in terms of thinking about race. There's kind of interestingly enough, like a trope that suggests that we don't have to talk about race when it comes to the Pacific, right? It's an option, right? You want to use it, you can bring it in, but you don't have to, right? So there's almost this kind of assumption that there's flexibility there. But I want to be sure that in my project that a Trans-Pacific that emerged out of Asian American studies did take race seriously as a category of analysis. They didn't want to run the risk of painting this kind of transnational frame outside of these dimensions of power and hierarchy. So I think, though, this is why some critics of my book have suggested that I overemphasize the U.S. imperial frame. I think it's because they may be used to seeing a historiography where race or empire is almost optional. It's not, well, let's think about the theologies and the religious elements, but do we really have to talk about, and let's talk about also indigenous agency. But that's because the Trans-Pacific frame embedded in Asian American studies uses critical race theory as a core part of its disciplinary thinking. Okay, so if you're bringing up the frame that I'm talking about with the Trans-Pacific frame, it's just built into the process. And so in doing so, I resist the temptation to erase U.S. imperial history when considering the history of modern creative Christianity. But I think it's no accident. I was saying to your class earlier that I think at least one of my critics who takes up this argument, is actually a well-known apologist of Japanese Empire, right? So who's known for denying the history of comfort women. And so in his review of my book, he said that I use the U.S. imperial frame too much, that it's using too much critical race theory, and I think it's no surprise that that I think if you're thinking about this period, if you want to paint a picture of Korean Christianity in the Cold War era as free of U.S. imperial imposition, right, which I think is the route that he's suggesting, then you're not using the same kind of Trans-Pacific frames that I'm using. And that's why it may read differently to a scholar like him. So yes, I think that temptation is there. So This picture of Korean Christianity in the Cold War is free of U.S. imperial imposition and free of U.S. racial hierarchy, then erases the history of U.S. militarism that also shapes this historical period. But there's a way in which I'm speaking to a historiography that still sees that kind of frame as a contested frame. So then how do I think about race as it pertains to trans-Pacific evangelicalism, or this particular story with crisscrossing the Pacific? First, and when looking at the history of modern U.S. evangelicalism, a literature you may be familiar with, I mean, a lot of these historians are featured in the news because of the current political situation. If you're familiar with that literature, you'll know that a black and white racial narrative is really crucial to that story. Okay, so books like Anthea Butler's White Evangelical Racism or Christian Smith Divided by Race, they show that 20th century evangelicalism is crucially a racialized movement, especially thought of in terms of like black and white terms, right? There are clear distinctions between black and white evangelicals. Curtis Evans' own work on Billy Graham and Martin Luther King Jr. shows that a social versus individualistic understanding of the sin of racism is what created a sharp divide between these movements. Okay, so this is ingrained in, this is a core part of the historiography of modern evangelical America. So how does a trans-Pacific frame intersect with this story of the racial divide between black and white, right? The understanding of racism as a social sin versus a personal sin. And I have two primary ways that I answer this question. First, that the transnational Korean subjects that I study are shaped by this black and white binary. Okay, so I engage that literature directly. And I want to highlight, especially what I do in chapter 3 of the book titled Orphans. And actually, Orphans, the Mirage of Evangelical Diplomacy, 1960-1969, and even my introduction to this particular literature on the Korean War and the history of orphans and international adoption actually started with a conference that Anne actually organized for Pan Autumn on the Korean War and religion. And there was this focus on transnational, transracial adoption, and it just blew me away. I didn't know that literature. Sujin Pei, who I cite, people came and they spoke on it. I didn't know that this fraught history that really actually
Alina Kim's coming next week too. Actually.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's coming to University of Chicago.
Yeah.
Alina Kim.
Yeah. It's like adopted territory.
Yes.
Yeah, so that is so fraught with this history of empire. So this chapter, when we look at the chapter in Korean War orphans, we see that they are positioned betwixt and between blackness and whiteness, okay? Because I'm looking at the 1960s and the rise of the myth of the model minority. And so, yes, absolutely, at the height of the civil rights movement, this shiny image of the trans-Pacific Korean War orphans who crisscrossed the Pacific, singing for World Vision, it tells a story of success. Right, that boosted a narrative of the U.S. as a global moral leader amid the Cold War, in spite of the ongoing racial injustices against Black Americans. And so you see this kind of betwixt and between the transnational Korean subjects formed by this Black-white racial narrative. So I engage the literature in that way, but it's important that the trans-Pacific frame pushes us yet another step. There's a temptation then at this point to want to read these transnational Korean subjects, and the Korean War orphans are here featured on the cover of my book. There's a temptation then at that point then to read these Korean subjects merely as orphans at the service of whiteness. Okay, the myth of the model minority then colors them as white, right? To read Asian and Asian American subjects to be only then through the lens of black and white, or black or white. But that's not where this story ends. Importantly, it's key for us to see that they're shaped by the racialization process of Cold War Orientalism as well. Right, which reveals how the myth of the model minority is indeed a myth. It's a racial strategy, right, that governs inequality. So in the 1950s and 1960s, the racialized politics of American evangelicalism depended on the exclusion of Black people, which books like Anthea Butler's shows, but also the racialization of Korean people vis-a-vis American evangelicalism occurs through the politics of inclusion. This is a different kind of racial move, right? The politics of inclusion. The US Cold War embrace of non-communist Asia is a racializing strategy. I think if we don't train our eyes to see that that's also a racializing move, it can go under the radar, right? Well, of course they embrace the non-communist Asians. Of course they embrace the Korean orphans, and it's just this lovely embrace, full of humanitarian ideals and absent of racializing processes. But as I show, and I build on Christina Klein's work, Cold War Orientalism, we see that actually here, the tight embrace of non-communist Asia through the incorporation of South Korea into U.S. Cold War politics is actually how racialized hierarchies get maintained. It's actually the tight embrace that creates the white over Korean hierarchy. And I think that at that conference that Anne organized, we saw that so clearly, right? But it's, if you use only a black and white racial frame, you can't see how destructive actually this kind of politics of inclusion or embrace really is. Yes, so then we see through chapter 3, these transpacific evangelical networks are not just propelled by a process of anti-blackness, but also anti-Asian sentiment. But they work through different processes, right? The result is unfortunately the exploitation of these children. For as it turns out, many of the children were not actually orphans. As I show in chapter 3, many of the children who actually toured with the World Vision Korean Orphan Choir were not parentless. This was an interesting part of the research, just doing the archival research, but then also doing the oral histories. Oh Ji-young, she's this child here, girl child, but I interviewed her, did an oral history with her. Oh Ji-young observed that from its very origins, the choir was not composed of orphans, though it was advertised as such. She recalled, quote, actually there were children who had families. The criteria was that children of the directors were not allowed to join, but when I got there, the director's children were there, and there were kids who had a sister and uncle, they had relatives. She felt very lonely because she was one of the few who had no family. And Kumja, for instance, later found her sisters. This was another one of the orphan choir members. Her sister had a large hair salon. They lived well. I found that so many of them had family. This is the part that when I reflect on it makes me sad. And children had actually various familial arrangements, reflecting the multiple ways that the Korean War shattered and divided families. Not everybody was an orphan, including across the 38th parallel, even if it did not always leave children parentless. And the two men who were in charge of this group, Bob Pearson, Reverend Han Kyung-jik, thought this was a mere technicality, but as you can see, the lack of accuracy disappointed the choristers. Not only this, but this experience has a even more troubling side to it, right? I just want to read this last piece and I will start to wrap it up. The World Vision organization starts to realize that actually the choir members are having a lot of difficulties, right? And so one of the directors, Jim Franks, I found in the correspondence in the archive, he expresses his concerns. Franks' concerns reiterated that the quote, orphan, he says, I don't feel another tour of any kind should be undertaken under these psychological and spiritual needs of the children in these special circumstances. Something has to be done to meet them. And Oh Ji-young herself recalls through an oral history that I conducted with her, her memories of Peanuts, who is standing next to her here, and his tragic death. She recalls, for the World Vision Korean Orphan Choir, we were trying to gather sponsors. It was a means for advertising more than sharing the gospel. It was to think and recruit sponsors. So some people said that they used us. This is a painful story, but during the first international tour, There was a boy who was my age and he was a biracial child she's talking about. His name is Kim Sang-yoon, nicknamed Peanuts. He was brilliant, but he had trouble adjusting. Instead of thinking things like simply like me, he had a hard time. One day he committed suicide. She was referring to Peanuts and she recalled the conversations that she had with him prior to his death. Quote, before he committed suicide, he said, what do you think of World Vision? I said, well, we should be thankful. He said to me, don't you think we just got used? I said, why do you think like that? What would we have done if we didn't have World Vision? I had a more positive outlook and he was more negative. Sometimes people were critical of the money that we raised. Instead of giving it to us, they gave it to others. He had this perspective and he told me this and then he died. He was like, they call me Peanuts, Peanuts, and they take advantage of me. I was like, why do you think they take advantage of you? Why not take that as an endearing nickname? The name is from the Peanuts comic. As I argue, Peanuts protested the commercialization of his story for philanthropic means. One might even say that through his suicide, he expressed a darker form of agency to critique World Vision's empire of care. Kind of darker side of this history. So this is to show you this is a tragic part of the story, the history that I reconstruct. And I argue here in this section that evangelical humanitarian organizations like World Vision, as much as they sought to care for the Korean War orphans, in the 1960s, the organization also burgeoned at the expense, troublingly, of children like Peanuts or OGM. We have to read this exploitation through the lens of racialization. But it can't be read if we only read their experiences through the lens of whiteness or blackness. It's because the conditions of war, the Korean War, the first hot war of the Cold War, that these children's lives are structured into a racializing schema of Cold War Orientalism. And I show here in this case study, but through the two other organizations, that these organizations came to power in part through racializing Koreans. So this is a racialized history that is important to reckon with for a few reasons. I'll just cover this and then we'll be done. First, it helps us to see that the history of white evangelical racism has both anti-Black and anti-Asian dimension to it. I do want to really highlight this because I'll say that usually the conversation ends with the anti-Black part of the story. And if I'm in the conversation and I bring up the anti-Asian piece, it's almost like blank faces. I draw blank faces, right? It's like, but what part, kind of raising questions, but like what part is anti-Asian? And I think that this history of Orientalism shows us the anti-Asian dimensions of it. Second, it helps us see that even, as I mentioned a bit earlier, when Asian and Asian American subjects are racialized as a model minority or even included in these organizations as quote-unquote proximate to whiteness, and of course that, there's so many dimensions to the myth of the model minority, but at the same time it's really important for us to specifically look for Orientalist racial dynamics. It's like in addition to, it's additive, that may be invisible to us if we don't step back and yet use another racial lens beyond Black and white. I find this actually to be perhaps in your classrooms and conversations, this is just happening very smoothly. But I have found that actually the racial conversation is really hard to navigate because there are all these dimensions to it. And the kind of structural conditions, like let's think about how war is racializing people. That is, it's often difficult to bring into the conversation. The last is that right now, Angie mentioned, it's AAPI Heritage Month, and there's this moment of Asian American representation, right, that we're living through right now. And, it includes the conversation on American evangelicalism. As key Asian American leaders are leading American evangelical organizations today, like the National Association of Evangelicals, right, Walter Kim. And I think there's an increased interest in Asian American evangelical experiences, even recently, like the case study of the Netflix show Beef, right, which has also attached with it so much kind of racialized, sexualized controversy too, right? So all of that has to get unpacked. But there too, you see this kind of interest in like Asian American evangelicalism, right? But I'm wondering if the racial reckoning that's happening in America today, including among American evangelicals, is also taking into account this transpacific past, right? This longer history of Orientalism, this longer history of war. That we're not just looking at only mid to late, we're not just looking at the present, but we're looking, deeper into the past, and also how race gets constructed beyond the nation state, right, through processes beyond the nation state. I have questions about, are we taking all of this into account with this moment of racial reckoning that we're in?
So I am not a historian, so I'm just going to touch upon several different dimensions that the book sort of positioned me as a theologian, right? So before I do that, I just want to say thank you to Professor Angie Heo for the invitation to be here. I was telling her that the last time I was here was this exact same day in this exact same space, doing something with, I don't know if you all know Helen Kim.
Yeah, the incarceration.
Yes, so it was something on feminism and social justice right before the pandemic. So anyway, it's nice to be here, and I want to thank Helen Kim for putting this book out into the world for us. So Race for Revival is not a book on Christian theology, but an examination of a particular strand, evangelicalism, and more accurately, fundamentalism, and its rise to power within the US and globally, particularly in Korea. This evangelical movement and the Christian theological strand undergirding it allowed the unrivaled consolidation of militarized imperial dominance of the US and its ascendancy in the global politics ensconced in a particular moment in the history of militarized violence and imperial dreams. This conjoined movement of US evangelicalism and US expansionism is not new in many ways, but resonates with and indeed is indebted to a long colonial history of race, religion, and empire making. Helen Kim deploys a trans-Pacific hermeneutic lens, I think, to interrogate the coterminous relationship between Cold War imperial desires of the US and Asia that rely on Christian theologies on salvation through conversion. A conversion not only to merely a strand of Christianity, but also perhaps a conversion to whiteness. White American exceptionalism, theologies that are just as expansive as imperial desires, to spread racialized, triumphant Christian theologies that have long served to undergird colonial and neo-colonial projects. Kim's starting point is that the perspective anchored in the Trans-Pacific hermeneutic helps us to recognize the amazing ways the US evangelical movement's emergence as a powerful political and religious phenomenon could not have happened without its regeneration through the growth of evangelicalism in Korea. I was reminded how similar it is to observations made by decolonial thinkers that the West was possible because of the rest of the world, that the wealth of the global North depends on the extraction from the global South, and etc. The phenomenal rise and resuscitation, or in Christian language maybe even, resurrection of a dying US white evangelicalism could not have been without its alliance and dependence on, ironically, the growth of Korean evangelicalism, an extension of itself in an already ransacked by war and previously colonized context of Korea. So not being a historian, I learned much from this book and ended up with no real critiques, but instead more questions that emerged out of my own interest at the intersection of decolonial studies, militarized imperialism, and the ongoing afterlives of Japanese occupation, the Korean War, and the past and present realities of being one of the most intimate allies with the US. To be sure, we have no afterlives here, but a continuation of a war at ceasefire, and of course for over 70 years of US military intervention and ongoing presence, and the entangled relationship of Korea with its supposed ally, the US. All to say that in line with Kim's research, in that not much has changed. As Jody Kim notes in her recent book, Settler Garrison, quote, South Korea is a site from which and onto which the United States projects its military settler imperial power, end quote. After Japan and Germany, Korea now has third largest number of US military bases, including one in Pyeongtaek that is now the largest overseas US military installation in the world after it spent recently $11 billion on expansion, the most expensive project on record for the US Department of Defense. So let me begin by noting how striking of a palimpsest image is evoked in the book's cover photo. If you remember the photo here.
Oh, sure. That's so good. I'm gonna need it too.
So I recall seeing in a children's Bible, because yes, I was Bible reading child. Graham's photo here reminding me of the Jesus photo, right? The little children surrounding him. Graham even looks like the most common and world famous portrait of Jesus, known as the head of Christ, by a Chicagoan, Warner Salmon, who never left Chicago, right? But who was a devoted member of the Swedish Evangelical Covenant Church. The portrait was done in 1940 and sold then over 500 million copies and multiplied in millions over when he followed up with other versions like Christ at Heart's Door and Christ Our Pilot. This racialized, Nordic-looking Jesus says not only about how Americans and evangelical Christians all over the world think about Jesus the Jew, but also about how they imagine God incarnate in this figure of Jesus, this white Jesus. Of course, highly problematic Christologically to me. But portraits like this, its saturation around the world, and the photo of Graham and with Korean children all create affective attachments, affective and theological attachments that are also intertwined with the condescending political infantilization and racial formation of Korea and its white Christian savior with messages of redemption and promises to end suffering. So just a few words about Billy Graham, this significant figure in Kim's book, because I think it's also important to situate her book and the Korean War as part of the larger global history. When Billy Graham passed away, for example, on February 21 in 2018, he was honored to lie at the Capitol Rotunda for 2 days, which is usually reserved for elected officials or military leaders. Turns out that Graham had preached in over 185 countries and territories and was referred to as America's preacher. And according to the House Speaker then, Paul Ryan, Graham advised 12 US presidents. While in the beginning, Graham may have been moderate when he came to things like segregation, he inadvertently fused evangelical Christianity with US capitalist and military operations post-World War II, especially against communism, as well as demonized civil rights leaders in the US. Graham operated and utilized what Kelly Brown Douglas, in her book, Stand Your Ground, calls two sacred canopies operative in Christianity in the US. Brown Douglas writes this, quote, in general, however, the religious legitimation of America's exceptionalism narrative suggests that to be against Anglo-Saxon America is to be against God. Moreover, it suggests that the further removed one may be from Anglo-Saxon family tree, the further one is removed from God. Whiteness in this respect is not simply cherished property, but it is also sacred property. It is virtually the gateway to divinity, the key to salvation. As the evangelical Protestant hymn suggests, salvation requires one to be made white as snow. Within the religious narratives of America's exceptionalism, anything that cannot pass the test of whiteness cannot get to God. Militarized imperialism, racist Christianity, and a country wrecked by occupations, war, and wedged between rising global superpowers, traumatized by a war that killed millions of civilians and the US scorched earth policy, leaving the land nearly unsavageable, becomes the place that received economic uplift through benevolent yet racist political and religious funding, while politically becoming ever more indebted to the US and straitjacketed into the global model minority nation, as well as get, I think, pimped out to do dirty work in Vietnam. In this confluence of evangelical Christianity in the US, in the context of brewing global anti-colonial movements and fomenting civil rights, Korea and the US entered into an intimate mutual aid of their own. In his book, African American Religions, Sylvester Johnson offers a critical insight that is not too far off the mark for the Transpacific in relation to evangelical Christianity and its neo-colonial global mission aspirations. Johnson notes, quote, the presumptions of American civil religion purporting that revivalist Christianization and aggressive US militarism were twin episodes of divine will began to function as common sense. And those who opposed this imperial vision of religion seemed inexplicably bizarre or veritable enemies of the United States. So it is no wonder that Malcolm X even referred to Billy Graham as, quote, the minister of white nationalism. Being mindful of the realities of Korea as a vital US mission field in the past and current reality in which Korea is the second most missionary sending country now in the world, very much replicating in many ways the imperial logic of US missionaries. Naomi Kim, in her article, Mission to the Graveyard of Empires, draws from Katie Cannon's concept of what she called missiologic immanent parrhesia and theological racialized normativity to connect dangerous racial logics laced in evangelical Christian theologies that purport and provide justification for these imperial iterations of Christianity around the world. For Cannon, a womanist theologian, the missiologic of immanent parrhesia serves as a link created between, quote, biblical urgency and cultural reasoning that legitimates the mission strategies of Christian imperialists. She argued that European expansionists coordinated Christian understanding of parrhesia, that is, the quickly approaching expected hope of the return of Christ as a judge to terminate this world order. And with the Great Commission that Helen talks about having a great role in Korea, in their transatlantic human trafficking. Furthermore, Cannon's theologic of racialized normativity refers to the constellation of structured white supremacy ideology that laces such theological thinking. This concept highlights European expansionists' belief that their charitable acts of quote-unquote civilizing Africans would help the so-called barbarians grow up in the Eurocentric image, indoctrinating them in the worldviews, text, and language. And this is what I see exemplified in the cover photo of Billy Graham with these children. So can we say that evangelical Christianity emerging from Korea is any different? Without arguing for equivalence, the transatlantic and the transpacific as geopolitical and religious sites of militarism and evangelical Christian dominance deserve more critical analysis. So evangelism has a long history, or evangelicalism has a long history of Christian complicity with colonization and imperial desire among empires seeking conquest and conversion. So let me go back in time to the word evangelion in Greek, which we could define as good news or news that bring great joy, and was originally a political concept in the Greco-Roman world. It was something that the soldiers in the Roman Empire used to say as they marched back into the cities after a conquest. As they marched into their cities with good news, evangelion, of their conquest for the sake of peace and security. From the time of Alexander the Great and to the Roman Empire, this word was used to refer to history-making, world-shaping reports of political, military, or societal victories. Jesus was born during Pax Romana, during the era of the Gospel of Caesar Augustus, who sent runners known as evangelists after every battle declaring victory. Christians subverted this view supposedly, but at the same time, they really did not. As Christianity became the religion of the empire with the Edict of Milan in 313, when it was officially recognized as a legit religion, and then in 3 AD in the Edict of Thessalonica, when it became the only official religion of the empire. The alliance of Christianity and Roman Empire long ago transformed a movement of an executed Jewish teacher into a religion of the imperial state. Further along in the collaboration between Pax Romana and what some refer to as a Constantinian Christianity in service of the empire. In July 1099, Western European Christians went on its crusade to Jerusalem, some say slaughtering over 40,000 Jews and Muslims in a few days. This crusade left an enduring legacy of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. The crusade against the so-called infidels was a term that onward Christian soldiers took up against non-Christians, particularly then against Muslims and Jews. Imagine the imperial reach possible when militarized Christianity, with the mission to save non-believers, infidels, communists, blacks, Asians, non-US democratic societies, aligned with military might and hegemonic desires of imperial US post-World War II. So I want to jump to 2007 from there, to Korean missionaries held in Afghanistan event. Right, so Nami Kim in that article I referred to, and her research on Korean missionary hostage in 2007, shared a response from the Korean lead pastor, right, of that church that sent those missionaries to Afghanistan. And after, even though he had 2 of those parishioners were dead, his name was Pastor Angie Kim, senior pastor of Semur Community Church, he actually had the nerve to say this. Quote, "We believe that this is God's providence leading us to other Muslim countries. I don't want this to be a stumbling block for missions." The Christian crusades against communists, Muslims, Jews, non-Westerners, infidels, non-believers of their brand of Christianity always appears need saving. So it's been 30 years since the US military, and I wanted to say a few words here in closing why the US militarism part is so important, because in history of colonization, particularly in European colonization at different sites, military always going hand in hand with the church, right? And so one served as a kind of a meta narrative to justify this kind of colonial process. How is this ongoing? Did this end, this process of militarization of Asia end? When things kind of cooled down or what have you? Actually, no, because it's been 30 years since, for example, the US military was asked to leave Philippines, and the economic development of that nation stalled because why? They lost the US sponsorship, economic sponsorship, right? But United States struck a deal with Philippines early this April to expand its military presence in its former colony to 4 additional bases, part of the Pentagon buildup this year in the Asia-Pacific region. Currently, US has about 750 overseas military bases in more than 80 countries. And this kind of global scale, as evangelical crusades, whether it's from the majority world or not, it is no wonder we have the rise of global Christian right. It's not just within the US. So, as a Christian theologian, I have to ask, for those who follow the way of Galilean Jew, how might we conceive of theology that does not need the death of others for us to live and have life? How might we de-link notions of social redemption from a single savior motif that often preys on the vulnerable? How might Christians practice faith and profess good news, evangelion, while de-linking from imperialist militarism that has long been the other side of Christian legacy that began a long time ago when it relinquished itself over to the Roman Empire? I'm left again with more questions, like, is it even a possibility of Christianity being decolonial? And I say this as a theologian. Can Christianity ever be indigenous? Is Korean evangelicalism with problematic theologies any better than the US evangelical theologies? Where are the decolonial Minjung theologians? How do they understand this proliferation of US imperial racist patronizing theology that finds religious salvation through whiteness? Is there more? Could it be that the evangelical reading of the Matthean passage, the one they hold as a crutch, the Great Commission, is misread through the eyes of imperial desire rather than counter-imperial narratives, as attested by biblical scholar Warren Carter, who notes that this Matthew 28 passage, quote, is subversively anti-imperial in its original context of composition. In response to Jesus' message and ministry about, quote unquote, the good news about God's kingdom, which sounded like imperial propaganda claims, Jesus is sentenced to the cross and buried in a tomb. But having been raised from the dead proved the empire could not keep him down. Jesus claims he was given all authority on heaven and earth, which actually was a contestation and trumped powers of the Roman Empire. So I want to end with what I think Kim does so finely and deftly, and that is what the late Edward Said referred to as a practice of counterpunctive reading, a kind of reading against the grain, and so direct us to the Trans-Pacific, specifically to Korea, for a much needed understanding of how it is possible that a war-ravaged country, through the embrace of a network of evangelicalism in the US, grounded in white supremacist ideology, became entangled in the nation, religion, and race-making projects in the US, as well as even surpassing the US now. So back to the cover photo and the smiling children. Korean War, to me, is inscribed in the smiling body of the biracial boy next to Graham, Kim Sang-young, and others who became the collateral damage of war, militarism, Christian evangelicalism, and forms of political and religious care through the US empire in Korea. I too would like to think that our people deployed hermeneutics of suspicion when it came to political and religious web of US presence, as Helen Kim notes, quote, "One might even say that through his suicide, he expressed a darker form of agency to critique World Vision's empire of care." I hope Kim's book generate conversations not only about what the US has and continues to do in Korea and elsewhere, but also about how the natives were not merely empty vessels to be filled, but subjects of history with their own practice of subversion and resistance.
So I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here again to engage Helen Jin Kim and in person this time for the second time. And I did warn you that the comments would be different this time around. So another slate of comments. A little bit about me and where my comments and questions are coming from. I'm an anthropologist, I'm an ethnographer, and I'm increasingly captivated by the work of historians, gifted with just the right interviewing skills to bring us into sensitive touch with oral history. For the reasons that we mentioned before, part of it is about the gendered asymmetry of the official archives. And I've also become increasingly interested, but also in truth concerned, with the state of the study of race and religion in the North American Academy. And finally, on that note, as I look to the future, I am an educator, I'm an instructor, I'm an advisor for so many brilliant and driven students who are increasingly interested in studying race and religion in America, critically and with more historical consciousness of America's imperial and transnational influence, for better or for worse. Race for Revival is a book about Koreans and Americans, and it's written by a Korean American. It's not a book about Americans and Korean mission history, a topic of already numerous studies. It's not a book about Korean Americans, per se. We could talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. And it's not a history of Korean American churches or the place of Christianity within the historical framework of the Korean American community or Asian American communities. So this is something, when I think of who does that work, I think primarily of David Yu at UCLA. And really, there's not much more. I mean, so everything that I just mentioned, there's still not that much writing on those things, aside from the mission history in Korea. So more on this point later. But what Race for Revival instead offers, or could be read as offering, is a critique of the very terms through which the North American Academy has examined and engaged Asians, and in this particular case, Koreans, within the field of American history. In this book, Helen plows past paradigms of ethnic enclaves and immigrant mobility. The subtitle says it all. How Cold War South Korea Shaped the American Evangelical Empire. The goal of Race for Revival, furthermore, is not to offer an equal account of both sides. It's transnational in scope, but yes, in response to our critics, parts of the history of Korean Christianity are not being told, necessarily because the framework is not a South Korean national one, but an American imperial one. The stories in this book are selected precisely to sustain the focus on the American Evangelical Empire. And so, how do we think about the moral and political problem of racial difference and racial inequality from inside and within the terms of American evangelical empire. And what does the South Korean perspective allow us to see about the geopolitical space and the virtue signaling place of race in the history of American evangelical empire? In her book's introduction, Helen outlines her methodological approaches to the study of religion in America through a transpacific lens on race, racial processes, and racial dynamics. And this is what she writes. On page 12, Race for Revival shows that Koreans' racial erasure, integration, and model minoritization were three key trans-Pacific racialized processes that also propelled a niche and fledgling form of a white fundamentalist America into the US evangelical empire. In another place, page 20, the task of trans-Pacific American religious history is not merely the acknowledgement of unrecognized historical actors or even a geographic turn, but more fundamentally an understanding of the conditions of inequality that have rendered these subjects invisible in history. So two elements, and this is now my voice, these are all, the quotes are ended. Two elements immediately stand out for me in Helen's argument for examining race and trans-Pacific history. One, the protagonists of her book are South Koreans, and more specifically, global evangelical imaginaries of Asians as race subjects. But ultimately, it's about what the racialization of South Koreans show us about the racial origins of American evangelicalism in white fundamentalism. It's about the racial origins of American evangelicalism, for all its self-understanding as colorblind and colorless, that its past and its originating past there's a fixed strand in white fundamentalism. This is significant because I just realized that I already read this. This is significant because American evangelical figures like Billy Graham are often understood to espouse a colorblind theology, a theology intent on saving the interiority of the soul. It's not viewable to the public, and not the skin. A more critical genealogy of Graham's evangelicalism that probes its white fundamentalist origins is suggestive, to say the least. And second, Helen's book shows us that the trans-Pacific methodology is not just about more Asians and Asian American representation and visibility. That is important. But to understand the conditions of inequality that shape the erasure of Asian and Asian Americans from history is also to understand the processes of racial marginalization internal to the writing of American history. Race for Revival then is centrally about white identity and the politics of white authority in American evangelicalism and the historiography of American evangelicalism. Yes, it's about the racialization of Asians as model minorities and integrated guests. But Race for Revival also suggests a social theory of race and racialization that is dialectical in nature, where whiteness is what is at stake in model minoritization and ethnic integration into the big old melting pot. This book shows us that white evangelical identity is created out of Asian figurations in the global empire, and that white evangelical identity is forged out of the encounter with Asian evangelicals abroad. There are at least three different strands of white American evangelicalism that Race for Revival probes and elaborates. And I think there are probably more than this, but I'll just draw on three. White fundamentalism, white compassion, and white revivalism. Each of these different angles on whiteness also gives us a different angle on racial inequality. Helen's a great storyteller. Professor Kim, I'm just gonna call you now. Helen is a great storyteller and a reader of history's characters, especially the ones hidden in plain sight. So Billy Graham is just that kind of character, big, charismatic icon, well-known, evangelical. I think Professor Angie Joh just said it all. Billy Graham got a special burial, and yet he's strangely hidden. And I'll elaborate a little bit more what I mean by this. What is hidden in Graham is precisely that racialization dialectic between white and Asian that Race for Revival brings out across different historical moments. For instance, and it turns out all of us are referring to Kim Sam-yong. Here on the cover, we've got Billy Graham with Peanuts, a nickname for Kim Sam-yong, one of the singers for the World Vision Korean Orphan Choir in the 60s. a Korean war orphan, Peanuts is a symbol of a global evangelical humanitarian enterprise. Here he's quite literally the poster child for World Vision, the largest faith-based humanitarian nonprofit in the world, with Graham, the great legitimator of the Christian faith. What we don't see in this image is that, and now we know because we talked about it, is that Kim Sang-young also ended up ending his life. Before he committed suicide, he said, "What do you think of World Vision?" I said, and this is Oh Cheong explained to Helen in an oral interview, "Well, we should be thankful." He said to me, "Don't you think we just got used?" Helen points out the crucial fact that the Korean Orphan Choir exemplified a big shift in American evangelical empire, the rebranding of mainstream evangelicalism as one of Cold War compassion. World Vision relies on a kind of white compassion for orphans anchored in a word, and Bob Pierce's word to boot, heartbreak. And indeed, heartbreakingly, on the other side of white compassion, there is the lifelong curse of gratitude, one which Peanuts knew too well. And it's a curse that Asians and Asian Americans continue to know too well. Being thankful, be grateful for aid, support, intervention, patronage, inclusion, in brief for American benevolence. And I just want to remind us that President Yoon Suk-yeol sang American Pie for Biden at the White House. That just happened last week. So for all the talk of salvation and uplift that goes with being adopted into the kingdom of God, there's also the slow degradation and disillusionment that goes with those burdened to perform gratitude to excess. Here's my cue to shift to pivot to another Billy Graham image and the dialectic of racialization embedded within it. And I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, so unfortunately I just was gonna just show you on page 129 of the book. There's this image of what Helen refers to as the two Billies, Billy Kim and Billy Graham, side by side at the 1973, this really famous crusade, mass crusade in Yeouido in Seoul, South Korea. Billy and Billy is how Helen captures this enormous, iconic signature event in Korean evangelical history. And it's important because it's quite literally how the gospel of American evangelicalism gets translated, even amplified for a Korean audience. It is, to borrow the late Lam Sane's well-known title, Translating the Message. In principle, translation is about equivalence. In principle, it's colorblind. And the evangelical translation of the message is predicated on the colorlessness of the souls. The idea that God doesn't see race, doesn't see color. So I have to admit that part of what I'm doing here is just making sure we never look at visual images of Billy Graham the same way again. So as I read it, at its heart, Race for Revival is a critique of just this problematic self-understanding of American evangelicalism as colorless and colorblind. Billy and Billy, the whole idea of their coupling, relies on the idea that revival is about winning souls. The power of global Christianity is winning numbers, heart by heart, individual by individual. In its theology of piety over politics, American evangelicalism is above social, or is purported to be above social movements and organized civic action. Until, of course, it's not. And now we see that now. This leads me to some questions I have for Helen, what she's hoping this book does in the world, and for readers and which readers. And I'm just gonna kind of talk my questions out, two of them, because I had to revise them after I saw Helen give a really informative discussion that was totally unexpected in my graduate seminar this morning. So I wanted to ask you a question about religion. I wanted to ask Helen, what is evangelicalism at the end of this story? Because there is a way, when I read this book, there's a constructive project that is still being extended. Like you're concerned about what evangelicalism has become. Is Asian Christianity doomed, Helen? Is Asian American Christianity doomed? Is it consigned to the dustbin of racial inequality? How do you think about where we are with evangelicalism? it doesn't mean that you're, I'm not saying you make prophecies, but I'm just wondering, is there anything to hold on to from his history? And I'm surely there is, but how do we, maybe this is too big of a question, but how do we even approach the problem of assessing what elements of evangelicalism would be salvageable? I also wanted to, I have several other questions, I realize not two. Okay, I'm interested in the place of Christianity in Asian American studies in particular, because I actually do see you as a leading scholar of this kind of work. Thinking about the place of Christianity in Asian American studies, and I do think that this is going to become increasingly more important. So what I would like to ask is there something specific, is there some kind of specificity to evangelicalism? That is, evangelicalism is not the substrate through which racial dynamics play out already given. Is there something about evangelicalism itself that generates and introduces new dynamics into Asian racialization in the US? And then, because it's the Martin where Tiffany's not here, it's the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion, I think a little public facing. What do we do with, or it's not, we have no control over this, but how do we think as scholars, and I know you've been called on by like NBC News or all, I don't know, different outlets to comment on the portrayal of Korean evangelical churches in Beef, for example. But I think because of the demographic kind of representation of Korean Americans in American evangelicalism, it seems that anything, if there's going to be an increase of Asian American representation on TV, which it looks like we're kind of maybe heading that direction, that means there's going to be more church scenes, it seems to me. So like Kim's Convenience, and there's such different churches, right? You've got like this mainline Protestant woman of color pastor in a mixed race church for Kim's Convenience, and then Mirari, we've got this rural Arkansas situation with new immigrants, right? And then Beef, you have an Orange County rock band, and everyone's like, this was the most underdeveloped thread of Beef. We wish we had gotten more of this. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, you don't get it? I feel like all of us have been in touch with this experience on some level. So I think that this is going to be a kind of, you have to address this, because these are the terms in which Asian American Christianity is being reproduced and produced, and there's no reception. We have no reception narrative. We have no narrative to give to them, to throw out there. I mean, I know that it's happening, but it seems to me this is why you're being called upon to comment on Slate or whatever. All right, that wasn't even 2 questions. I already have I guess I have 3 more questions then. I know that this is about American history foremost. And I kind of said this, that I think this is about American evangelical empire, but part of me is like, what exactly is Asian American studies about this book? And I know it's the frame. I understand, especially when you spoke today, you said this is inspired by Asian American studies, the work in Asian American studies. But it's kind of thinking like, what all the Koreans go back to Korea. They're all committed to Korea. But that's different than us, right? So what would be Asian American about this story? And why would it be important for Asian American studies? And would that change the paradigm, kind of the frame of Asian American studies? I also want to say that Asian American is the weirdest category ever. I mean, you said the 70s that came up, and it's totally true, the origin of it, but I'm sitting here, I'm still flummoxed because I feel like there must be, Asian American, what is that category? I mean, what is that? Who is in that? And does that make sense for the kind of history that we're looking at here?
Mhm.
And here I am thinking about
Mhm.
the past of Japanese occupation and the simultaneity of Japanese occupation with the American intervention, or I don't know how to call it, Americans in the war in the peninsula. Okay, I think that was it. Let's just get started.